Hey folks, welcome to the DarkHorse podcast. I am sitting today with Jamie Wheal, who is the founder of the Flow Genome Project. He is the author of Stealing Fire and his newest book, Recapture the Rapture. Jamie, welcome, my friend. How are you?
Fantastic, man. And as you said, as good as we can be, all things considered.
As good as we can be, all things considered, which in light of the topic of your most recent book is a heavily qualified statement, but we will get there. I should probably say up front a couple things. I have not fully read your book. I haven't had it long enough to do that. I have, however, used the time with your book as well as I can, and I have perused all the way across it, and I am blown away by what you appear to have done. I am looking forward to delving into it completely, and I am also looking
Nice.
forward to discussing the content of the book with you today, even though there will be things that I have missed in my perusing. In general, I have a kind of arm's length relationship with books that I'm often kind of reluctant to talk about because intellectuals tend to have a kind of reverence for books that causes them to cast suspicion on anyone who expresses doubt. But my sense is that as much as there is a lot of positivity obviously conveyed through books, there is also a downside to them, which is that when you have read a book, you take in the author's perspective, and it is often hard to restore your mind to the configuration it had before you did that. And so there's a downside. With your book, I'm not worried about this because you do such a fantastic job of effectively documenting your own mindset and leading people through the things you want them to discover. So my sense is it is a very different kind of book, and although I haven't fully read it, I highly recommend that others do, and I'm sure I will be returning to it after I have read it.
Oh, thank you. And I think you and I share. I mean, we've come up as educators, and one of the sort of sacrosanct ethical commitments is the somewhat cliche teaching people how to think, not what to think. And so, not only is that a stake in the ground, which is the intention is to increase the quality of our discourse and our reflections and our decisions. But then there's also just what's going on right now, and pretty much anybody that I look up to and turn to in the fields of neuroscience, psychology, sociology, politics, climate biology, the closer they are to experts, the less certain they are of anything. In general, just as an epistemological stance based on the humility of deep exposure to the complexities, nuances, and contradictions. And then we are, obviously, well, I wouldn't say obviously, we are perhaps and arguably in a world of increasing, intersecting, compounding, and conflicting exponential curves. So the mapping and modeling of that can only ever be provisional. And
Yes,
false certainty is probably our biggest bane right now.
I would agree. False certainty is a huge problem, and if I can see if I understand what you just said, because of the number of, let's say, dyadic relationships between concepts, which seems to be growing at an exponential rate, we are effectively rescuing what we think we know with the equivalent of epicycles, and we are, in some sense,
Like Ptolemaic, like the little loops in the loops.
right, exactly.
Yeah.
And we are, in effect, waiting for what will certainly be a radical simplification of what we understand. That, in effect, what we understand is becoming more complex because we are having to integrate more things with it. And when we can figure out where to stand to look at it, it will probably not be massively complex. It will be simpler and more intuitive. But having not found that place yet, we have to deal with skepticism with the complexity that we're forced to deal with, which, as you point out, results in people who see this problem being more cautious rather than more certain.
Yeah, I mean, and I have no idea. I mean, to your point about kind of the synthesis on the other side, right? Um, and I'd love to test this with you, but it seems to me that we are hard coded for binaries, for either ors. at the root level of, electron spin up, down, single cell organisms like life, death, or food, foe, black, white, good, bad, you name it. And, it's what Aristotle called the law of the excluded middle. It's literally the foundation of the scientific method, which is force binaries. And obviously anybody who's remotely thoughtful, from philosophers to theologians to physicists, have been like, well, actually it's actually less and less about, I mean, obviously contrast, either ors, is a very effective way of sorting the world, sorting the universe, but it does hollow out the shades of gray if you're just going for black and white. And so that move from contrast, either or, friend foe, to context, it is situational, it is dependent, it is nuanced. Like, that feels like a potential lens that we could apply to good effect. Because, right, I mean, it's Hegel 101. It's like all dialectics all the time. And whether it's progressive conservative, whether whether it's technological utopianism or ecological collapse, like it's all happening, and it all depends. So context, and really being willing and able to be much more precise in our locations, in our epistemic locations, in our intersubjective relating, all of these things, it feels like we could just do with a healthy dose of more provisional contextualism.
So, yeah, I would alter that slightly, I think, which is to say that these dichotomies are tools. And
Yes.
there is a degree to which they are illuminating. And for each of them, there is a point at which they are more confusing than helpful. And, the ideal mind figures out how to use the tool to its degree of constructiveness, and then to abandon it at the inflection point. And obviously, you can't do a perfect job because it takes some time to discover that the tool has become unhelpful. But nonetheless, that's the objective of the exercise, is to figure out not whether some phenomenon is binary or isn't, but it is to say, to the extent that we look at it as binary, what do we learn, and then at what point are we blinding ourselves with that very same insight? And some things are binary. The closer you get to the fundamentals, the more things, it's either an electron or it isn't, right? It's hard to be nuanced about it. Or actually, maybe I've picked a bad example because of the sum over history's understanding that even an electron is, in some sense, a cloud of probabilities. But nonetheless, an electron isn't a proton, right? It's a fair binary. But when you get into complex systems, each phenomenon is impacted by so many other things that there's always cause for nuance, even when a binary may tell the bulk of the story.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's waves and particles, and which is the helpful lens for the task at hand.
Right. Okay. So, how to bring the audience into a discussion of your book? Let me first say, I would say that your book is in a genre that is new and growing. It is part of an older tradition. There's obviously, as you point out in the initial part of your book, a long tradition of people being concerned about the direction we are headed and what its implication is for the immediate future, much of that thinking not being very productive. But your book, and you feel free to correct me if I'm misportraying it, but your book diagnoses a dangerous trajectory that humanity is on at the present, attempts to dissect the nature of the problem. It describes tools that might be productively wielded, and then proposes a direction that you believe we should head. And so in some sense, it is in the genre that I would say is books about potential game B solutions to the failures of game A. Is that fair, or do you feel that I'm dragging you into a milieu that isn't yours?
Well, I mean, on a pure branding thing, I would have thought that, the existing meme of bringing your A game, we would have wanted the good thing we were trying to get to be game A. but aside from that, my sense is that, I mean, this is just my academic background. I mean, I thought I was going to be an elbow patched, wood paneled professor. I was all done on my PhD coursework by the age of 22, and it was in historical anthropology. And then just kept learning, kept growing, realized that, the temping of academia, I was like, oh, whoa, maybe that's not that. I thought I just had like one more year to gut it out. And then it was just, smoking a pipe and thinking thoughts. And then I got disabused of that. But for me, the area of inquiry is kind of Janus facing, sort of it looks backwards and forwards. And looking backwards is a kind of hybrid discipline of neuroanthropology. You look at humans, you're like, what are these curious customs we hominids seem to deploy, and what is happening today, and are there precedents to that? Can we look back through the ethnographic, through the historical record, and see where else have we done things similar? And the kind of neat hybrid these days is that we also have neuroscientific information. We have psychology and study, we have biology, we have all of these things that we can then bring to bear of why do the things we do socially and culturally as tribal primates, why do they work? And then once you can understand the sort of the Lego blocks of that, then you can look forward into culture architecture. So now we understand we've got case studies, we've got evidence, and we've got basically kind of a pattern language. We see how these things tend to go together and how they tend to work. And then we can say, now, if we're going to build or innovate or architect new versions of how we gather, then might we do that with a little bit more skill because we know the pieces and their functionality. So to me, it's neuroanthropology looking backwards, culture architecture looking forwards. And if you wanted to kind of distill this book into its essence, it's an attempt to create an open source operating system for transformational and anti-fragile consciousness and culture. So what's the Linux for the future? And really standing by that, which is, it's not like that any tops down solutions, no matter how idealistic or noble, tend to degrade to fascism over time. And we really, I mean, I just take it as an article of faith, but I think there's lots of case studies to support this, that we are actually smarter, better, and more resilient the closer we are to our own unique conditions. So localized and adaptive responses, honoring specific cultures, life ways, value systems, et cetera. Like, we're better bottoms up than we are tops down. But everybody building a spaceship in their driveway, it doesn't work either. It's a complex, hard thing. So can we share, like Linux? Here's source code. It shoots straight. It tends to spit out answers that are more or less congruent with the original conditions. And then you can modify it, you can adapt it, you can mutate it. And then if your modification works better, great, because other people will then adopt it. It'll propagate. Like, we don't know. We need a million solutions, and 999,000 are probably going to go tits up. But if we can accelerate and harness and sort of scaffold and support heightened human innovation in the realm of architecting functional civilization and society, then maybe we have a chance. Maybe we have a way forward.
All right. I want to drill down on this a little farther, though, because when I say game B, I am unfortunately invoking an entity, an organization, a group of people who met, and I don't mean to. What I mean to say is that game B has become a label for a category of thought. If you take all of those of us who are part of the living cohort of humanity, some small number of us have recognized that actually you don't need to understand with precision where we are headed to recognize that the trajectory itself will be fatal short term, and that requires some architecture to find our way out. I would add, evolutionarily, that we're very good, humans are, at figuring out what to do in circumstances where our ancestral wisdom has come apart, but that our modern version of this puzzle is unlike any past version in the sense that the tools we would typically bring to bear to figure out what to do next won't work. We cannot evolve our way out of this situation by having certain groups go extinct in the attempt to discover a way out, and just figuring, working from whatever subset functions. In some sense, humanity is all in it together this time. And so your book, I read, is a very deliberate attempt to describe what I would say, you tell me if you differ, but to describe a crisis that we have found ourselves in, and to map, as you say, an open source architecture for basically bootstrapping our way out. And is that fair?
Yeah, and I mean, and to be very clear, right? There's 1,000 things wrong, screwy, scary, consequential that are happening. So, and I just chose to focus on what felt like an under discussed and an underdeveloped missing link in that discussion of our meta crisis, which was, that everything is going exponential for good and bad, except for meaning, except for our ability to make sense and then decide what to do about it. And that, to your game A, game B notion, I mean, if we take everything that's kind of we've been living and is in the historic record as game A, I think you could actually tease that apart even and say that there's, meaning 1.0, which is almost all of human civilization and history up until really even sort of the last century. You can timestamp it back to the French Enlightenment, whatever, but like up until super recently, meaning 1.0 was almost always analogous or synonymous with organized religion and communities of practice. And obviously we have seen the erosion of that, and that starts with things like the rational, empirical, scientific revolution, French Enlightenment, Nietzsche's God is Dead, but also more recently, Pew Research Foundation finding the collapse of allegiance and affiliation. Less than 50% of Americans now, for the first time ever, don't align or orient to any kind of institutional community of practice or faith. The nuns, the NONEs, are the fastest and largest growing denomination in America. You're like, wow, okay, that's novel. And then throw in Catholic Church scandals, the erosion of trust, everything. So you could just say that edifice is collapsing. And at the same time, meaning 2.0, which you could make the case is sort of modern liberalism, right? Again, the sort of, democracy, inalienable rights of citizens, civil rights, market-based economics, that whole bundled package. That's, lately sometimes called sort of late stage capitalism. Well, clearly the last 4 or 5 years has really been eroding our trust and faith in those institutions as well. And meaning 1.0 was, it offered the promise of salvation, but at the cost of exclusion. Like if you believed you were saved, and if you didn't, you were damned, more or less, kind of around the world, right? If you were among the elect, you got in to the good life. And modern liberalism, coming out of the religious wars of Europe, through the Middle Ages to the Enlightenment, was like, whoa, okay, we need to, that way lies ruin and bloodshed. So we're going to try something else. We're going to offer inclusion, right? All men and women are created, are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, regardless of race, color, or creed, right? Wonderful notion, partial execution, but that was the reverse promise. Instead of offering salvation at the price of inclusion, it offered inclusion at the price of salvation, separation of church and state. God is dead, and no one's going to tell you what it means. So the question for kind of the game B move is what does meaning 3.0 look like? Because we're clearly in a meaning crisis, and the absence of those two pillars has created this hollowed out vacuum in the middle. And rather than us all sort of doing what Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and young Sam Harris might have said as the new atheists, like God is dead, get rid of superstitious straw men and angry sky gods, stand on our own 2 feet and become rational materialists and do the secular humanist thing better. We're not seeing that. Right? We're seeing this, in that vacuum, we're seeing people getting shunted to extremes of fundamentalism. And that can be doubling down on traditional fixed religious beliefs, but it can also be scientific fundamentalism. It can be ideologies. It can be anything with extreme certainties of worldview and sort of Manichaean good and bads. Or if you're not bought into one of those, then nihilism. None of this matters, burn it all down, diseases of despair, addiction, depression, suicide. So the question is how do we rebuild, how do we pop the long pole back in the tent that can shelter us and provide community and weather the storm with meaning 3.0, which would be, can we do both? Can we take the best of both? Can we create inclusive salvation? Is that actually a thing we can even hope for? And then how would we do that in a decentralized, open source way so that we're not just replacing one ism with the next one?
Yeah. In a sense, I'm wondering if it's fair to say that we are in a meaning recession. I mean, almost literally. That in effect, we had achieved a kind of meaning. The scientific materialism has been marvelously productive in describing a great many things that are true and useful enough to build with, but it has actually created the crisis as well. And that what I'm seeing and what you describe, I think you memorably say early in your book, that it's a moment at which you would expect us to be at our best, but we are at our worst. I'm sure I'm just paraphrasing there, but
Yeah.
I see this as well, and I'm almost stunned by the degree to which every counterintuitive thing of value is being uninvented. Right? We are losing confidence in many of the most important innovations that we've made, and it's resulting in a kind of it's like the worst of both worlds. Not only is it faith-based and metaphorical, right? Meaning that you cannot infer from it directly, but it also has not stood the test of time. And so what we're getting are beliefs that sound good, are very frequently wrong, and are unfalsifiable by virtue of the fact that we have thrown out the good part of the scientific materialism, which was the robustness of our ability to test what's true.
Yeah, and to your point about sort of right when we should be at our best, and this happened this time last year, right, with the dawning realization of a global pandemic. There was a number, everyone was kind of looking for reference points, and certainly FDR, Churchill, World War II like became a familiar theme. Like, okay, it's one of those. Is it really one of those? I think it might be. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And Churchill's, never, ever, ever give up, and victory gardens, and keep calm and carry on. We kind of got ready to do that. And I think people were ready for some leadership to potentially ring that bell and get us in line. We were kind of digging back into our cultural memory of like, okay, I think it's one of these times. And instead we ended up with the most batshit upside down factionalism, schizoid denialism, and just we warped. And I mean, if this was our dry run, we just failed badly. And my sense is that, and yours and Heather's work directly informed and inspired my thinking on this, which is where you had made the case probably a couple of years ago now, of, hey folks, be careful. Like, if we either are required to step into a global perspective, or we're going to regress under stress, and we're going to go back to tribalism of any stripe. It could be ethno-tribalism, but it could be ideological tribalism, and especially the internet, you can find your corner and your pocket and your people, no matter how wacky, right? And you made the case of like, hey, be really careful, friends and neighbors, if you play the tribal identity card, because it's so deeply ingrained in our biological, social, tribal primate structuring. And you look at the neurochemistry of belonging. Molly Crockett, who was at Oxford and she's now at Yale, has done some really neat work on that. She's studied everything from positive versions of tribalism, like the Burning Man experience, to negative versions like political rallies and those kind of things. And and it's when we experience an erosion of certainty, trust, and status, our dopamine and serotonin levels plummet. We start becoming less altruistic, more prone to being edgy or to lash out. When we get together in groups, our dopamine levels spike, but that actually creates a decline in hyper altruism. So we basically, it's like somebody being coked up at a party. You basically just become a self-absorbed asshole, and then the super spooky and sometimes counterintuitive one for people is the role of oxytocin, and that in pop culture, it always gets that moniker of like the cuddle drug or the trust hormone or the love hormone. And you're like, well, it's also the curb stomp your neighbor. It's the ethnocentric tribal, like, yes, it bonds mother to child and lover to lover and owner to pet, to dog, and those kind of like all those groovy things. But it also massively increases the likelihood of you being willing and wanting to other the other with extreme prejudice. And so this sort of like tribalism is destiny and humanism is optional. And to me, that's a conversation that I'm not sure we're having with enough urgency, because we see the extremes on both the left and the right, and they would swear that they are enemies of each other. But if you pop up a level and you're like, well, what's actually going on, and what are their truth claims, and what are they trying to bring about? In most instances, it is a dismantling of the current system, which holds, and again, however idealistic, however partially delivered upon, it has nonetheless been the ideals we've rallied around in times of crisis, from the battlefield of Gettysburg to, and Lincoln, to the rubble of 9/11 and George Bush, to Obama and the Charlottesville shootings. Like time and again, we've been like, okay, to Martin Luther King, in Washington in '63, we've been like, hey, there's this beautiful thought experiment, the infinite game, right? Let's include everybody in it, and let's have this humanistic project. And at the times of crisis, we've dusted it off and we've recommitted to it. But there's been a shift. There's been a seismic shift in the last decade, and intensifying in the last 5, and then again in this last one, of fuck it, we're breaking that treaty. We're not even pretending that we're trying to get everybody on the bus. We're blowing up the bus. And I'm sure you've come across this study. I just found it so singularly representative of this. But it was a university in Australia that studied 500 Americans across the political spectrum, including alt-right identitarians, radical social justice activists, and then somewhat sort of centrist moderates. And they assessed them against dark triad personality, so sociopathy, Machiavellianism, narcissism, and then also authoritarianism. And the moderates in the middle, who had their own belief systems but also extended the right for other people to hold theirs, so kind of just pluralism, they didn't score on any of those 4 qualities. But both sides of the far political spectrum did. So they basically were like, bad actors, regardless of what flag they're flying, increasing the factionalism. And so, if you use that James Cost notion of finite and infinite gains, which most folks are familiar with, like finite games, win, lose, up, down, tribalism 101, and infinite game, win, win, bring as many people into the game and play the game for as long as you possibly can, right? We're actually seeing, the fact that these sworn enemies are actually on the same team. They're on team finite game. And what's at stake is that versus the infinite game. And this is what, I'm curious as to your thoughts on it, but my sense is that in our grief, in our frustration, in our rage, dissatisfaction, anger at the bill of goods that we have collectively been sold, right? That temptation to burn down our society, our civilization, our value sets risks destroying this tender, fragile, incredibly precious human experiment of the infinite game. And the Robespierre thing, Robespierre, card carrying, one of the originators of sociopaths, right, hijacking liberty, equality, and brotherhood. The French Revolution was pretty badass to start with, but he said, if you want to make an omelet, you got to break a few eggs. And the finite gamers, to your evolutionary thesis, all they've got to do is poke, prod, and provoke other people to other each other, including themselves, and they win. It's like Darth Vader being like, strike me down, man, just strike me down in anger and I've won. Versus the infinite game, which is like trying to put Humpty together again. It's like magnifying glasses and super glue and tweezers. It is asymmetric meme warfare, because all the finite game bad actors of any and all stripes have the second law of thermodynamics on their side, and right, and humanists don't. And I don't feel like in the discussion in the public sphere, we almost think like, may the best meme win. This is a contest of equal ideas, and it's not. It's lopsided as all get out.
Yeah, it couldn't be more lopsided. I was going to bring up entropy myself. But yes, and this, I think, goes exactly to the point I was trying to make about the space of the small number of people who have clearly seen that some game B is necessary because game B is about to blow up. Among the reasons that it's about to blow up has to do with the asymmetry in power of those who wish to take apart past gains, how the failure of recognition of how fragile what we've accomplished is, right? So to me, as an evolutionist, there is no conflict whatsoever between the observation that our society is very powerful and generates a tremendous amount of wealth, and the observation that it is almost impossibly fragile, right? Those two things are completely compatible. And so
yes, with all of our confirmation bias and heuristics that make it hard for us to wrap our head around.
Hard for us to wrap our head around. And as you point out in your book, the Pax Americana has now dominated enough generations that there's this sort of sense that things just go on this way. And that's really the exception rather than the rule. But people don't intuit it because they have no personal experience with it coming apart. I also quite resonate with your point about the last year having been a test that we have failed spectacularly, and that is an indication of just how urgent it is that we start thinking differently about solution making. All of it does, however, make me want to address something which I know is there because the last time I saw you in person, which I guess would have been in Austin, where you live, am I right?
Mm-hmm.
In Austin in 2018 would it have been? Well,
could have been, yeah.
In any case,
we had that nice lunch.
Yes, we had that nice lunch, and it began to dawn on me that you and I are on parallel missions because of exactly the recognition that we were just talking about. I think we're built of very compatible but very different stuff in some ways, and it occurred to me in talking to you how can I put this? How deeply troubled you are by humanity's predicament, right? And I felt that looking at your book as well, right? I think, there's a part of me, and you tell me if I'm projecting something onto you that isn't there, but there's a story that people need to understand in order to figure out what it is we have to do and what sorts of tools would have to be brought to bear for it to work. And then there's also this watching the clock run out, right? And these two things are in conflict. Can people be brought up to speed, or can enough people be brought up to speed fast enough that the clock doesn't run out on us? And I see you being very patient about that and very thorough, but you also acknowledge right up front that many things in the book really, under circumstances where there was more time, would need a further exploration, but just in order to sketch the bare bones, you're forced to just get right to it. So in any case, have I described you at all in terms of your sense of the urgency and how you feel?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, look, as I said, I mean, one of the subfields that I concentrated in historical anthropology was, it was kind of Guns, Germs, and Steel meets Sapiens. So it was fundamentally clash of civilizations. What are vibrant, resilient cultures? Especially, I was fascinated with proto-contact. Like the notion of and then the cavalry came, and then all the Indians were removed to reservations. Like the tragic end game interested me less than dialing back the clock to when it was still a fair fight, and you could really hopefully more accurately read viability and resilience of given different cultures, radically different cultures. So 300 years of the Iroquois Confederacy, totally, leading the French and the English into shoulda go blind territory and gaming them brilliantly, or anything like that, right? but at the same time was also a lane of environmental history. And so, Donald Worster, who famously wrote Rivers of Empire, was just like, here's hydraulic societies, right? From Egypt to the Mormons, to the Anasazi. Like, this is what happens when you irrigate for your food, folks, and here's the case studies. And so, and then, you're looking at the Oglala Aquifer and the Great Plains and how we're siphoning that to pump water, or the fact that 40% of the irrigation, or that they've built tunnels from the Eastern Sierra to feed LA. And that by the time someone in Beverly Hills gets a drink out of their faucet, it's been peed, excreted, and purified and recycled 9 times from the snowmelt, and that 40% of the water that gets shipped in open air aqueducts to Vegas evaporates. And you're like, oh, shit, friends, this doesn't pencil out. It may not be this year, it may not be next decade, but it sure as shit is not a sustainable run. So that, like, staring into that particular abyss was something that happened to me in my early 20s, and it just made me a lousy cocktail party guest.
Well,
and then yeah.
No. Well, I don't know. Maybe I didn't know you in that phase. So maybe you were a lousy cocktail party guest. I rather doubt it. My guess is the party changed at the point that you deployed this kind of understanding. But I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I do want to parse this out a little bit further.
Yeah.
What you're describing, this doesn't pencil out, was the phrase you ended on, right? I have my own version of this, right? I call it, it needs a better term, but it's the theory of close calls, that basically you can deduce where you are with respect to hazards by figuring out how many close calls you've encountered, right? They describe a curve, and part of that curve is unsurvivable. And so, if you've had 3 near misses for a serious traffic accident in the last year, probably there's something wrong with your driving. It's not guaranteed, but you can tell. And so when I look at just the list of serious disasters that we've faced in the last decade, for example, or if we go back a little bit further, we've had the financial collapse of 2008, we've had the triple meltdown at Fukushima, we've had the Aliso Canyon leak of natural gas, we've had the Deepwater Horizon leak in the Gulf, etc. In other words, we've got this list of close calls, all of which were survivable, but they tell us something about the magnitude of hazards that we're playing with. And we can infer the rest of the curve. We can infer from Fukushima that a much worse accident could have happened, orders of magnitude worse. Why didn't it? We got lucky. None of the fuel pools cracked, right, during these explosions, but they could have. It wasn't like being clever prevented it from happening. We just got lucky, right? So you don't want to be dependent on luck for your survival, right? You never want that to happen to the extent you can avoid it. And we're there.
Yeah, we're so there. And I think I just read an article in the last few weeks that was just basically talking about that. Like, we actually may have been sailing way closer to the wind than we ever imagined, because we've just got perpetual accumulated survivor bias. Like, right, we've like, the largest meteor crater we've ever mapped is like 1 mile across, because if there'd been one that's 3 miles across, we wouldn't be here to map it. And like all of those kind of things. It's like everybody in the NBA, playing basketball must make you tall. It's the correlation causation things. But the idea that, like, how many tight spots have we just ducked to even be here in the first place? And is that a sign of our brilliance or success, or is it just utterly random statistics,
right,
that have delivered us to this point?
And it's a little bit of a combination, right? Like, we do get clever, but too late, and we far too often end up persisting out of luck. I will say that the upshot of the theory of close calls, when one deploys it personally, is that when you detect that something you're doing is resulting in luck being the reason that you made it through, you should treat each instance as if it had gone the other way, right? If you step off the curb and you are not struck by a car, the inference you should take is not, well, I must be doing something right because I wasn't hit. the inference is actually I did everything necessary to be hit by a car, and the fact that I wasn't hit by a car is immaterial. That was the luck part. So I should alter my behavior radically rather than very little as a consequence of this observation. But if I can head back to the question of what drives you, and actually, I did want to contrast it. What I suspect is distinct is that you are driven by the emotional horror of allowing what is happening to humanity to unfold without doing everything in your power to prevent it. And I must say, I think everybody in this sort of Game B space has to have some mechanism for dealing with the recognition of where we're headed, because it really is so appalling, really, the needlessness of it, right? As you point out, the vulnerability of the infinite game and the likelihood that fools will be allowed to drive us into the reinvention of a finite human game is so tragic. In my case, I think I proceed from the recognition. In fact, I say sometimes that I know of no reason that we are too late to save ourselves. I believe saving ourselves is still possible, but I'll bet against us. All right, I'll do everything in my power to make sure we don't screw this up. But if I had to guess what happens next, we miss the opportunity, right? Now, why do I say that, right? For one thing, that tends to demotivate a certain number of people, right? On the other hand, there is something necessary in order to play around in this space of solution making. One has to, or maybe one doesn't have to. Maybe the point I'm getting at is that I find one of the things that's most fascinating about you is how close to that emotional motivation you are, right? I have to find distance from it in order to think about these things, and it's a natural way for me to approach it. And I see you as almost doing the opposite trick, which is staring directly into the abyss and kind of keeping an eye on it in order to keep you going. Am I off in left field here?
Well, I mean, I'm only like whatever. I'm a mutant that doesn't have perspective on what is, totally boring or unique about my own lived experience. I just worked under the naive assumption that everybody kind of thought things and saw things the way I did. But my life was always split between academic study, like fascinated about the deep cuts and the research, but then also direct experience and, of the most raw, alive living I could possibly do. And you and Heather have done amazing stuff down in the rainforest. Like experiential learning was a thing I was always passionate about. So like mountaineering, guiding. And so by both professional training, but also by disposition, I probably sought this out. I feel like I'm always scouting ahead of the group to figure out what's next, what's around the bend, where's the next crux, like the hard thing we have to prepare for, where's the next resource, water, campsite, whatever it would be, and shuttle running into the future to try and map and spot that, so that the rest of the party, the rest of the group has a chance of making it to that place. And I even end the book, like on the one hand, this was completely, and it still might just blow up and destroy my career writing this book. It's the most ridiculous, grab every single, like tap dance through the minefield, God, sex, death, and rapture ideologies in a world that's lost its mind. Let's bundle them all together, talk about them all, and hope it goes well. Right?
You forgot about the psychedelics.
Yeah. Yes, drugs, sex, God, death, and the end of the world. What could possibly go wrong? And and there goes my my corporate speaking career, if I ever had one, right? So, but on the other hand, I felt like I couldn't not. And the inspiration I took was something along the lines of like the Svalbard seed bank, up in Scandinavia, of like, hey, what are all these heirloom seeds? Can we put them in a vault because we might need them later? Or even like the Irish monasteries that they had the palimpsests, like the reskin parchments where they would write and then overwrite because it was so precious for their illumined manuscripts. And then they ended up randomly being this hidden treasure trove of some of the ancient Greek writings that then got rediscovered and kind of kicked off the Italian Renaissance and that whole Neoplatonic revival, which kind of gave us the seeds of, the Enlightenment in us today. So in the writing of the book and the attempting to make it an open source toolkit, I was like, I have no idea how this is going to land. It could go over like a ton of bricks in 2021. But is this potentially a little manual where somebody someplace could use to reboot vibrant, thriving, healthy, pro-social culture? And that's kind of what I had. That was my commitment. It was sort of Bhagavad Gita, like you're not going to get what you want, but you got to do it anyway. So
Right.
stack up and make art,
Yeah. Well, all right. That's interesting. In my darker moments, I have wondered if, I'm not a believer in fate or anything like it, but if my obligation isn't to try to document what happened here, because it would be too hard to stop it. Now, it's a thought I keep control of, and I shunt it away to keep myself going on the task.
So wait. So say that again. I want to get
Well,
that.
to me, it looks like this. I know that I think I know that we could save ourselves, and actually what we produce now could be, we could deliver on the promise of the civilization that hasn't quite worked, that we are presently participants in. But I don't expect us to do it because, as you point out, I see us getting dumber rather than smarter, which, that could be the adaptive valley. It could be the darkness before the dawn, but there's a really good chance it's not, which means that, well, either what happened here will be invisible to everyone else in the universe permanently, right? Maybe we just join the silent majority of the Fermi paradox, or somebody happens by and they look at the ruins of planet Earth and they say, what happened here? And I don't think there's a good description for them to find. And that's sad, because the lesson of it might be for them to be able to save their civilization, right? A spacefaring creature would have a lot to lose. Maybe they wouldn't be spacefaring at this level if they hadn't figured it out already. So maybe there's nothing for them to learn from us. But I do wonder if the obligation isn't, in some sense, to just create something that says, all right, let's describe in game theoretic terms what happened here and why something that didn't have to end came crashing down, right? And then where do you leave it, right? What do you write it in? Do you write it in Bakelite? That's a very durable substance. Where do you leave it? But anyway, this is my dark side, and I keep it at bay by basically imagining that we're one headed for a waterfall, and we're one to have a very low chance of being able to paddle fast enough to get out of the pull of the waterfall. There's still no point at which your chance is so low that it makes sense to stop paddling, right? So, basically my sense is, let's paddle like hell. Let's see if we can do something surprising here. And that is not, it is not an emotional thought for me, right? It's just like, well, logically speaking, what else are you going to do, right? Let's see if we can turn this around. So, that's how I get there. And what I'm trying to tease apart here is that I have the sense that this looks very different from inside your skull. And yes, I recognize the problem of it being very hard to regard oneself because our experience is so dominated by our own consciousness, and it's very hard to step outside it. But what is it like for you to confront the peril of all of humanity and everything that has ever been simultaneously, as you clearly do?
All that you touch and all that you see and all that you lie, beg, borrow, and steal, and everything under the sun is in tune, right? Yeah, that.
But the sun is eclipsed by the moon. Yeah.
Yes, there's no dark side of the moon. Maybe it's all dark, right? So yeah, like right. So I mean I track you, right? And I think that you mentioned game theory, and certainly we have lots of friends that are deep in that world and map and model many of those permutations and outcomes. And generally, when I speak to them, I end up soul crushed and in the fetal position for several days afterwards. Like literally, like very rarely do I have a actual visceral reaction to conversations. And there's times where I feel queasy, I feel like puking, I feel like literally running away. Um, and and um, and it occurred to me, and I mean, this is a um, helpful fiction I'm willing to sign on for myself. I'm not asserting it, but in the same way that like the whole field of behavioral economics that Kahneman, Thaler, Dubner, Levitt, the Freakonomics guys like popularized, which was, hey, Homo economicus, the idea of a rational individual making trade-offs and always making the best self-interested decision, that's a total fiction. That's bullshit. We are freaky, contradictory, moody. We're just fickle people. And that isn't that more interesting. And in the realm of game theoretics, it feels like we've almost got Homo Machiavellius. What is the self-interested, cynical son of a bitch who's always going to do the shitty thing, multipolar traps, you name it, right? And to me, there is something. I do, to your point about how many near misses have we had and all that kind of stuff. And you could look at the Cold War, like we should have blown each other up 1,000 times. And there's that Russian dude in the sub who just didn't push the button. There were so many near misses. There were computer glitches. Somehow we didn't. And I feel like even if it's just an article of faith, we don't hold it up as a law of nature or physics, right? We just say, hey, leave space for grace. Leave space for grace. Like, does any of this stuff pencil out actuarially? Nope. But shy of just slitting our wrists now and being done with it, can we leave space for grace? And to me, like, yes, it rhymes and it's kind of a neat concept, but like if you look at history, that's what has always happened. Like the moments that history has turned, right? Those cusps have been when someone unleashes this asymmetric force multiplier of humanity. And Gandhi called it satyagraha, he called it truth force, right? Howard Thurman, the African American mystic, brought it back to the States, rebranded it soul force. His mentee MLK then socialized that in 63 in his I Have a Dream speech, when we can meet the majestic heights of physical force with soul force, right? Nancy Keene at Harvard Business School, wrote that book, Forged in Crisis. It was Dietrich von Bonhoeffer, the Lutheran pastor who tried to assassinate Hitler. It was Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, Abe Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and one other. And it was basically what I found so badass about her book was it wasn't hagiographies. It wasn't like these retrospective, like, look at these heroes that did this thing. She went into their letters and their correspondence and what was actually going through their heads at these moments, these cusps. And it was no idea what we're doing. We just have to try something. We're going to just lob a Hail Mary and fingers crossed this works out. Like the Emancipation Proclamation, like every kid gets that in grade school and high school and college ad infinitum. Lincoln was at his wit's end. He had zero, he was despondent and had no confidence. Like to your point, I wouldn't bet against us. Like he wasn't that this was going to change the Civil War or win for the Union or or create a multicultural post-racial society. Nothing. He was out of bullets. This was his last one. And so that to me is the premise of this whole book, which is not just a plea for courage and curiosity and connection, but hopefully a toolkit. Like it's absolutely inadequate to just kind of scrunch up our eyes and wish for it. Like we actually have to go do it. And if we can, then can we unlock that force multiplier? That space for grace is us. It's not UFOs. It's not baby Jesus. It's us showing up and doing the impossible, because there's no other option.
Oh boy. Well, this is great. It does effectively establish the point I was searching for here, that you are sometimes reduced to what you describe as a fetal position by discussion with others who have looked into the abyss, is effectively the thing I was wondering about. I will say, I I don't know why I'm obsessed with this, but I do think figuring out what the various motivational structures are that cause people to show up for this kind of work is key, because in effect we
Mm.
are looking for the others. And I will say I never end up, well, I've been in a fetal position, but only as a fetus, um,
Only when I had to.
right.
Yeah.
I mean, dude, just not a lot of space, but anyway, I mean, I don't recall it that well, but uh, in any case, my sense is, look, I guess I just want you to look through my eyes for a second, and then I want to look through yours and
Mhm.
figure out what we can learn through this. I know with, I believe, near perfect certainty that nothing I do could possibly matter in the long term, right? And I could just keep pushing this out, right? Chances that anybody remembers me 500 years after my death, pretty low. Um, Chances if I beat that one that humanity survives another 1,000 years, pretty low, right? Chances if we figure our way through the peril that we survive to have to figure out what to do when our galaxy collides with the Andromeda galaxy, pretty low. Even if we defeat all the puzzles, ultimately, there's something at the end of the universe, heat, death, or whatever, right? This is all going. Every species that has ever been will go extinct, including mine. No matter which way you calculate it, it is impossible for anything ultimately to matter, right? So that's a terrible thought.
That there's the screaming abyss. Yeah.
But it's not actually. No, 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 no. To me, it is the opposite, right? The
Mm.
fact is, I believe in things, even though I know those facts to be true, right?
Yes. Well, yeah, and I would call that a transcendental existentialism. Like, let's not dress this up, lipstick on the pig, whistle past the graveyard, take your pick. Like, let's just acknowledge the bare facts. And yet, there are still things we choose.
But not even and yet, right? This is the part I'm having trouble articulating.
Hmm.
Once you recognize that there ultimately is no mechanism to save ourselves, then there's a
Mhm.
question about, well, what should we do? And one response, I suppose, would be hedonism, right? I find that
Mhm.
abhorrent, but I can imagine somebody getting there from that conclusion. But to me, my sense is, okay, we now have to scale back what it is we're trying to accomplish, right? If we can't escape the heat death of the universe or whatever stands in its place, then what can we do? And one thing that I think we can do, which strikes me as a practical scale of goal, is to recognize that even though I'm aware of the futility, I'm glad to be alive, right? I like it. I'm glad my children are alive and my wife, and I'm glad to be talking to you. And this is all very nice. And the question is, doesn't that result in a moral obligation to deliver the possibility of having such a life to as many human beings as we can possibly arrange? Which does not mean living simultaneously. It means how many generations can we make the human experiment continue? And how can we
Mhm.
make those humans who live as liberated as possible to pursue meaning? That seems to me like the moral obligation of what we currently understand about our predicament in the universe. And I like that project, even though
Yeah.
I know it's not durable, right?
Well,
I
and
know
it's
I'm
and
not
it's a it's
durable.
a it's a parsimonious ontology, right? You're like, hey, we don't need to gussy this up. Just the idea of holy shit, we're alive. I mean, there was a great po- postcard I saw. It's become an Instagram meme, but it was basically it just had a little kid sitting on a crescent moon, dangling his feet, kind of thing, and it said, "We are in space. No one knows what's going on. I love you."
There it is. There it
Right?
is. It's I used to think something like this thought as a child, which was, imagine that what we were wasn't capable of recognizing that there were others, right? Imagine that you were a kind of being that just didn't have the sensory apparatus to even know that, that there were others, right? And what a profoundly lonely thought that is. And the very fact that we have the ability to, like, not only know that there are others, but to exchange abstract ideas, to talk about values, to come to agreement on things. This is such a marvelous kind of creature to be. And we take it for granted and we ignore it and we treat it badly. It's like somebody's given us a marvelous car and we go, do donuts in the parking lot rather than honor the gift or something. So, yeah, I guess the point would be this. Let's say that we take the argument I've made for the futility of everything we will do, and we scale it back to the human dimension, right? So that's humanity ultimately will be a temporary and futile exercise. We could say the same thing about each of us as individuals, right? Now, I could react...
Ashes to ashes, man.
Right. But I could react to the fact that I know that I'm going to die and that my whole mental apparatus is going to come apart. I could respond to that by staying inside and trying to purge every hazard, right? And preserve it as long as I can. Or I could say, screw it. All right, I know I'm going to die. Done. I'm going to actually gamble with that recognition. I'm going to take it as liberating rather than stifling. And I hear this in your writing and what you say when you speak very differently. You have a kind of rather than just embracing the futility of it and taking license, you have an elaborate schema for categorizing the values of life. And anyway, it's fascinating to me because I think it ends up in the same place through an entirely different route.
It feels like that. And my long-term partner and good friend Julie she'll often just laugh at me because, like, I will, like, map things out to infinity and back, and I'll be like, would be good idea to pat shoulder now of your friend and apply physical touch. She's like, really? You could have just loved me, and I've had to, like, solve differential equations to the back and beyond. So yeah, there's some just part of me that just kind of sees things in zeros and ones and schematics and ways forward. But ultimately, it's super simple. It's the Oliver Wendell Holmes thing of, I don't give a damn for the simplicity on this side of complexity, but I give my life for the simplicity on the other side. And I think that there's quite a bit in the existential risk game be clever people bucket, where there's an awful lot of wallowing and thrashing around in the complexity, and the idea that the solution to that complexity is even more scintillating and brilliant complexity. But I think, right? I think at some point, just fuck it, like physics trumps metaphysics, friends. Like, it doesn't matter whether you're a libertarian, whether you're a doom and gloomer, whether you're a seasteader, whether you're a psychedelic renaissance or a blockchain enthusiast. Like, we're just going to be running smack dab into physics increasingly, and the best laid plans of mice and men and the memeiest thought leaders are just going to, their theories are just going to be running onto the rocks of reality. So let's just keep our eyes peeled. But to your point, I mean, I think that just to unpack that Bhagavad Gita thing, like that idea of how do we maintain being passionately committed to our part to play without being attached to our cherished outcomes. Right. And in some respects, it's, Admiral Jim Stockdale, that famous Stockdale paradox. He was the highest ranking POW in Vietnam. He found out, he was in there for like 9 years in in a Viet Cong prison, not friendly. And he noticed that all the pessimists who became POWs died. No surprise. But he also noticed that the optimists did too. And that was because they would be like, oh, the boys will be home for Christmas or Easter or July the 4th. And when those milestones came and went, they collapsed and literally gave up the ghost. So that the Stockdale paradox kind of got encoded as be ruthlessly realistic about short-term reality and infinitely optimistic about possible outcomes. And to me, and so and in fact, our buddy Zach Stein, right, who, Harvard trained theorist, educator, psychologist, generally, I think, open-hearted, wise dude.
Yep, me too.
He hipped me to a model that I haven't been able to get out of my head since he shared it. But it's and you may be familiar with this. It's a Kabbalistic notion of three phases of basically human maturity or ensoulment, and it's the pre-tragic, the tragic, and the post-tragic. And the pre-tragic is, you know, I anybody can grow up to be president or an astronaut. I'm going to find my Prince Charming or my Sleeping Beauty, right? My life is well, and that could be as brief as literally what you said, the fetal position in the womb. And then I get spat out of a birth canal into a whole harsh, cold life. And it's scary. And I didn't opt for this. Or it can be all the way through chasing all the brass rings of academic success, internships, professional thing. I'm a partner at McKinsey or my law firm, or I'm a tenured professor. I got all the rings, and I stay pre-tragic, but invariably life will drop us to our knees, and disease, illness, despair, relation, heartbreak, bankruptcy, you name it, like the vicissitudes of life happen, and we enter the tragic. And most folks get trapped there or crushed there. But there is that far rarer and precious move to the post-tragic. And if we can do that, right, and if we can do that, then we have a chance. That's kind of where soul force, that's where satyagraha lives. It's not in the denial or the solving or the transcending of the tragic nature of this human experience, but it's in the deep embrace and then the getting back up anyway move.
Yeah. All right. Sweet. Because so there's this, I haven't deployed it in a way that it has had any impact in my field other than to generate a small amount of mockery. But the my field misses a fact about evolution that is so transformative that in some sense I think we're just waiting to grapple with it. And the idea is that effectively lineage is a selectable evolutionary target, that selection cares about something that I would call lineage. And all evolutionists know this at small enough scale. We all understand kin selection. But the fact that this scales up arbitrarily.
What do you mean when you say that, the arbitrary scaling?
What I mean is kin selection doesn't stop at some degree of unrelatedness. That is to say, there is a calculation, a kin selection calculation, that we are not capable of doing on paper, but that we could discover the calculus for. And having done so, we would understand a lot about human history that we are so far scratching our heads over with respect to evolution. And in short, you don't need the calculus to infer the meaning of lineage. Lineage is very simple, which is to say, you and I and every other individual is wired to see and care about things at a certain distance, not because that's the limit of what matters, but because that is the limit of our likely influence, or at least would have been for our ancestors, right? An ancestor who cared about things 100 generations later would have been wasting their time because they had no influence on what would happen 100 generations later, right? 7 might be the limit or something like that. But it doesn't mean that what happens 100 generations later is immaterial. It just means it's inaccessible. Okay. So, in essence, what you are suggesting, the embrace of the futility, is I think, a tighter, more metaphorical encapsulation of a truth that is hard for us to speak, a truth that exists in the physics, actually, but that we don't yet have the language to say, right? Which is to say that the ephemeralness of our life is actually immaterial to what we are built for. We are built for lineage. We are built to the extent that our actions have an implication on where our genes are 100 generations from now. We should care very deeply about it, even if we're not wired to care, right? So we have to hack the architecture in order to correct for our vast power, because we now do have tremendous power over whether there are any people on this planet 100 years from now or not, right? We have that influence. So
yeah,
So in any case, it is always, it ought to be true that deep belief systems speak metaphorically about things that, should we care to, we can recover analytically, right? That we can do the math and discover that something that we say actually maps onto some real thing in some way that ought to shape our belief systems and our values and our behavior. And I think that's what you're describing in effect.
Well, I mean, because I agree. I mean, I often say, especially if you notice, at least I've noticed this, especially in the kind of progressive left side, with a touch of new age spirituality and that kind of stuff, there will be people who, when faced with the current meta crisis, will then go all kind of fuzzy and dissociate into indefinite timeframes. And they'll be like, oh, well, maybe this is the Kali Yuga, or maybe, like forests burn down to create new shoots. And you're like, yeah, they do. And it's going to suck for us, and basically, if it's outside my lifetime and the lifetime of my children, it's effectively academic. Like, it doesn't impact my short-term survival planning, which is what I need. But the opposite thing you were saying, which is kind of expanding our frame of past, present, future, ancestors and descendants, right? There's a lot of fascinating research that actually shows that we become more resilient when doing that. So like children who are aware of intergenerational family stories, they do better on test scores. They're less susceptible to depression and suicide. They are literally more resilient. It's almost like having a little short wheelbase Jeep going down the road with stiff suspension, bouncing along. It's just me, atomized, rational individual. And every success or failure or setback is mine and mine alone. And I feel it fully, versus the long stretch limo of, my grandparents and my children and their children. And it smooths out the ride. And right. And we are literally more resourceful. And another just beautiful piece that from some of that research was that, and actually you're a part of a family and our family's the best, actually inoculated less well. It was a poorer buffer than, we're a family, we've been at this for a while, we've had our shares of ups and downs, and we're still here. And so, right, that kind of just blended reality. And I haven't, this is not a fully baked thought, but I'd love to run it past you, which is, my sense is that, obviously back in indigenous times and even into traditional agrarian times, with high fixity of place, most people never ventured further than 50 miles from their birthplace. I'm Miller's son, the son of Miller's son of Miller's son. What do? We run the mill. And like, what is our faith? It's the faith that we grew up in, and there's that synagogue, church, or mosque, and this is just who we are, where we are, doing what we do. And so even then, identity was somewhat smeared intergenerationally, right? And deeply bound to place. And then we end up with hyper atomized, rational, individual consumer consciousness, especially into the 20th and 21st century. And that can't take the hits, because if I don't get mine for me now, I'm bent, right? I collapse. And actually, I end the book, funnily enough, with like, okay, most of the book is my best effort at fixing this. And then the end, which my editor did not want me to write, but I couldn't in good conscience not. I was like, hey guys, here's the deal. We might do everything we possibly can and still not make it. And back to the Stockdale paradox, the boys are going to be home for Christmas, right? We actually, if we really want to talk about what is an anti-fragile, a durable perspective on what's going on and what do we do now, it has to be able to survive crushing disappointment and setback. Otherwise, it's not a durable philosophy or way forward. And Jonathan Lear at the University of Chicago wrote a book called Radical Hope. And it was actually a study of late 19th century Plains Indians removal to reservations. And he said the inability of a civilization to conceive of its own demise is the blind spot of most societies, right? He said, but radical hope isn't waiting for the ship to right itself. It's not, oh, we're in a piece, we're in a rough seas, but then there's going to be palm trees, and white sand beaches. It's an abandoning of hope, of bargaining hope. And but the maintenance right, of a belief that at some indefinite point in the future, in a way we cannot conceive of from here, there is resolution, and it is worth us putting our back into it now, right? And to me, that one feels about right. And if you look at communities from the Roma to the Kurds to the Tibetans to the Ashkenazi, take any perpetually dispossessed peoples, right? They've always had that. It's the Moses to Canaan. It's 40 fucking years in the desert, friends. And I might not even get there. I mean, MLK said that on the night before he was shot. I may not get there with you, right? But we're going to keep on striving. And I feel like there's not in a retro romantic way, but I feel like there's absolutely some vital re-extension and connection of our self-sense, of our identity, of what's in it for me is actually what's in it for us, everyone, everywhere, every when, not just me now. Because the just me now is probably going to get increasingly gritty for a while.
Yeah, this is perfect, actually. And I have sometimes said that I'm very troubled by the idea of the Jews being God's chosen people, but I do like the idea that we're God's anti-fragile people, and that the idea is,
Yeah.
a perpetually dispossessed minority population. It's improbable that such a thing would survive as long as we have, and so there's some kind of wisdom in the recognition of how one even thinks about the puzzle, and it does not involve a obsessive focus on self and whether I'm getting mine right. It has to do. There is this more inclusive lineage phenomenon, and I think almost anyone, almost any decent person, can find the the basis for this kind of thinking because, I mean, this will be the easiest of exercises for you. But if you consider the question about how you feel about your family's well-being should something happen to you tomorrow, right? It doesn't change your sense at all of the importance of what happens to them. Your presence, or yes, you'd like to be there. And frankly, if I put it in the context of my own life, if something happens to me, it will be a terrible setback to my family, but it doesn't change the degree to which I care about them. And one can imagine a narcissistic person thinking, well, yeah, I'd like my family to be happy for lots of reasons while I'm here, and then as soon as I'm gone, it's not my problem, right? That's a terrible person. So the recognition that whatever life is can't possibly be about the individual, right? The individual comes to an end and is ephemeral. Life is clearly, when it is done right, about something more durable than that. And the point I'm trying to make is that the degree to which we lose sight of the importance generations down the road is an accident of evolutionary history.
Yes.
Evolution should have programmed us to see it should have programmed a Buddhist approach, rather than one that was so heavily based in the practical that we have the myopia of our ancestors who had no influence over things a century down the road.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, we could have done the Bodhisattva commitment, everyone, everywhere, everyone. And instead we all got our own personal Jesus. And Tim Wu, the Columbia law professor, net neutrality, that stuff. He wrote a fascinating book called The Attention Merchants, and it's all about the history of marketing, basically, and how, like, I think 4 of the foundational, these seminal early 20th century marketers were all failed preachers. And you end up with this absolute porting over of, like, original sin kicked out of the garden. You've got chronic halitosis or acne or an embarrassingly dirty kitchen floor, whatever it would be. And here is your hockey stick redemption promise. And now redemption is via purchase and consumption, right? And the more we fragment and atomize and valorize and sort of steroidally boost your rational, fragmented, egoic identity as the source of all salvation and possibility, the more we've created like hyperkinetic little marbles pinballing around, but we haven't created coherence. and cultural resilience and buffering, right? That is arguably a key piece of what we need going forward.
Yeah, that's very good. And it also explains, in some sense, why we seem to be accelerating in our vulnerability to these game theoretic failures, where um, the conflict between well-being at the individual level and well-being at the collective level increasingly defaults to the individual and sabotages the collective, which at one level makes sense because the individual is in a position to betray the collective. And at another level doesn't make sense because we all come from lineages that managed not to do this, right? And so the extent to which, as we become more modern, we become more vulnerable to errors that our ancestors, even if they did not analytically know how they were avoiding them, did manage to avoid, is impressive. So I take from your point about the increasing kinetics of the individual marbles driving the fate of the collective set of marbles. I think it's a point we should be paying very close attention to.
Yeah, I mean, and that in some respects, that almost gets us into like the tragedy of the commons, right?
Exactly.
As well as game theoretics, right? Because the idea is, if I am Homo Machiavellius, if I am just that individual choice maker based on, basically instant gratification, seeking point, seeking pleasure and avoiding pain, I'm going to do shitty things all the time. And the notion of rooting in lineage, rooting in culture that has some pro-social buffers. There was a fascinating book I actually ended up coming across in grad school. It's called Enchantment and Exploitation, and it was a study, like this multi-century study of northern New Mexico mountain villages, right? So harsh, limited resources, right? How did people get along here? And it was a contrast between Mexican sheep herding societies and then the range wars, right? The basically Eastern capitalized ranchers coming in. And in the Hispanic communities, there were built in shame structures from excess accumulation. Right. So if one guy decided I'm going to be the sheep baron, then his mother, his grandparents, his uncles, they would start razzing him like, "Hey, asshat, what you doing? Like you just drained the pond, or you just trampled the river, or you just overgrazed the pasture that like the rest of us were planning on using next week." And there were checks and balances and buffers against asymmetric resource accumulation and concentration. And then the range war dudes come in again, Eastern capital, let's go, 5,000 head of steers. Let's fence this, instead of usufruct land rights of like, which was the origins of the term Indian giver, was the idea that, Westerners would like sign on a piece of paper and then expect total and exclusive access to land. And then most Indian treaties were like, no, we'll let you hunt here as well, and we won't kill you. Like that was what we thought the exchange was. No one can own land. What are you talking about, right? And right versus like barbed wire and shotguns to protect, and then seeing the ecological impacts when you have cultures that are broken from local buffering of resource allocation and distribution into just pure extraction, smash and grabs. So like, how do we do that in a postmodern way? Right, that says, hey, don't be an asshat. We all live here.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And my favorite example of this is Salish prohibitions against fishing more salmon than you can use, right? But you'll find it in every ancient culture that was local to resources that were prone to overexploitation. This is in large measure what Eleanor Ostrom famously discovered about how basically we do avoid tragedies of the commons, races to the bottom, and every other form of collective action problem. Of course, in the ancient traditions, it's all written in metaphorically, and it invokes metaphysical forces that are not real, but they stand in for real things. I have argued it's in the book that Heather and I will. It's going to emerge next fall.
What is it called? What is it called?
A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, but we have a chapter in there on what I call the fourth frontier, and we talk about the the Maya and other temple building societies, and whether these temples actually are a buffering structure of exactly the sort you're describing, that an obligation to, I don't know how much you know about Mayan temples, probably a lot, but the Mayan temples are actually onion-like in the sense that it's not like somebody drew them out on a piece of paper and or whatever they would have drawn them on and then built the thing, but they actually grow, right? So that they're, the temple starts out small and it keeps getting larger, and that effectively the investment in these temples and the roads, the sock bays that go between these little city states, that is an investment that did not turn into more Maya that needed to be fed, right? So, in other words, by modulating the investment in these physical structures, our argument is they would take the pressure off of the civilization so that it was not constantly at the edge. A good year would produce a higher population and a bad year would cause conflict. The investment in these structures would allow modulation of the resource and protect it, which of course would then be partially explanatory in how the Maya lasted so long on fragile tropical soils.
Okay, so this is a total tangent, but you're the guy I can ask, so I'm going to ask it, right? Are you familiar with David Reich's work at Harvard, all
Yeah.
the genetics, right?
Sure.
So fascinating studies of everything from Neanderthals to Homo sapiens to population of the Americas and all this kind of stuff. And it just is what it is, right? You do the DNA analysis, it tends not to lie. I mean, you can have goofs in measurement and decoding, but like that story trumps anybody's philosophical or theoretical explanations. So it's upending, a century of anthropology and history, right?
Sure.
But so talk to me, because Yuval Harari, right, among many others, and Sex at Dawn, Chris Ryan, I was just talking with him last week. Like there's a number of folks that are these days, it's become newly fashionable to put a pin in the map at the beginning of the Agrarian Revolution and say that was the beginning of the fall. That was where we ended up with excess work, social inequities, poorer nutrition, et cetera, patriarchy, you name it, ownership, property. That was the fall. Hunting and gathering was just awesome. And that's where it went tits up, right? And yet, you look at the genetic records, and whether it's that, the tribes from the Siberian steppes, the Indo-Aryan, basically, that swept into Europe, you're like, mimetically, they were fitter. Something happened. Like we ended up with what we ended up with through a series of evolutionary and adaptive challenges. So what's your take? What's yours and Heather's take on kind of reconciling a retro-romantic look back of saying that, that was the fork in the road we should have gone back to, versus, well, it seems like it kind of worked, or they wouldn't have replaced those populations, or the memes and the norms wouldn't have perpetuated. How do you pass that?
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have enough time to go deeply here. Maybe we should revisit it. But in some sense, this is simple. And the problem comes from trying to infer a moral lesson from these transitions. I mean, obviously, the Agrarian Revolution allowed many more people to exist on the same pieces of territory. And it involved surrendering a great deal of autonomy. And we can talk about the trade and whether it was worth it and whether you'd prefer to be a hunter-gatherer. But I think there's no question that at the level of effectiveness, there's a reason that the agrarians replaced the hunter-gatherers overwhelmingly across almost every landscape. And that's because it worked. But the problem is worked doesn't mean what we would like it to mean, right? And in essence, the argument that we make at the end of our book, and an argument that I will elaborate in the future, is that we are wired for something that is so mind-numbingly stupid that no rational person could possibly honor it. Our purpose, the human purpose, is the same as every other species that has ever evolved, and it's just barely worthy of comment. On the other hand, the machinery...
Well, bottom line, is it just fornicate and die?
Not even fornicate. It's just get your genes as far into the future as you can, right? One way to do that is to produce lots of offspring. right? It's not the only way, but it's one contributing factor. But the point is, you don't want to have the same purpose as a liver fluke, right? Or as coronavirus or any other creature out there. That can't be much of a purpose if we all share it, right? On the other hand, the tools that human beings have been granted by evolution in order to pursue that purpose are absolutely marvelous and capable of staggering accomplishment, insight, compassion, beauty, all of the best things about us. So it is time for our conscious minds to sideline evolution's purpose and to replace it with one that's worthy of us. That's readily doable. The hard part is doing so in a way that does not give an evolutionary advantage to those who refuse to come along, right? That's the question. Can we do that? And we may have to leave it there, but I think there's a lot to be said for recognizing that our purpose is unworthy of us and that we are finally capable of articulating a purpose that wouldn't be unworthy of us. It's time.
Well, and if I could just try tying this up, because
Sure.
in the end of the book I mentioned the Jesuit theologian Teilhard de Chardin, right? And he was both a paleontologist and a theologian. He was banished by the church off to China. All of his books were suppressed until after he died. But he articulated this, and I think he wrote this back in the 20s or the 30s for the first time. But he said, "Hey, there's going to be three intersecting curves as we get to the end times, right?" He's like, "There's going to be the carrying capacity of the planet. There's going to be the people that are drawn towards effectively the infinite game, right? Everyone, everywhere. And there's going to be people, like you just said, refusing to play that game and committing to smash and grab tribalism." He goes, and at the intersection, at the crisscross crash of those three curves is the omega point. And he said, and at the same time, giving the whole event its significance and meaning is, we don't know which way this is going to play out, but if we can get there and we can get to the tipping point, then he says, we will engage in the process of Christogenesis, like literally the body of Christ at the end of time isn't going to be a second coming. It's going to be an umpteenth coming. It's going to be all of us or none of us to get to the omega point. And that feels like, I mean, as far as a ripping yawn, right? Like that feels like a decent story to try and live into.
That's a beauty of a point, and interesting. I didn't know that point, and interesting. Omega is an important term to Heather and me. We have used omega to signify something very closely related to that, which I assume is pure happenstance here. But anyway, I look forward to a conversation in which we can explore that question further, because I feel like this is a pause and not an end of this conversation.
Absolutely.
I have a commitment that I have to go to. So, Jamie Wheal, it has been an absolute pleasure. You don't have a copy of your book there, do you, that you could hold up?
Somewhere. In 20 seconds, I will.
All right. The book is Recapture the Rapture. I highly recommend that people get a copy and read it carefully. It's a pleasure to read. It's beautifully written. In addition to being full, there it is. Look at that. Beautiful.
God's Eye Nebula and everything. And recapturetherapture.com is just where anybody can go. There's a whole open source toolkit, PDFs, all the models, all the infographics, kind of, lots of useful resources if folks are interested.
Wonderful. All right, Jamie, I look forward to our next conversation. And
always, man.
All right. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Tuning into the DarkHorse podcast. We'll see you next time.